My name is Morgan Bennett, and I was 34 years old when the happiest surprise I had ever planned for my parents turned into the morning my family finally split along a line that had been forming for years. On June 20th, the day of my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, I drove toward the $510,000 cottage I had secretly bought for them on Maple Lake. I expected to find my mother laughing, my father trying not to cry, and a brass key waiting in a velvet box inside my briefcase. Instead, I found my mother standing in the gravel driveway, trembling so hard she had both hands pressed against her stomach. Two unfamiliar SUVs were parked near the porch. A steel lockbox had been bolted to the front door. Beside the mailbox stood a freshly sealed wooden sign that read, Sawyer Lake House Retreat. The cottage I had spent nearly every dollar I owned to create for my parents had already been turned into a short-term rental by my brother-in-law. He had accepted bookings, collected deposits, hosted strangers, and convinced himself that the house belonged to the family. What he did not know was that 3 months earlier, before I told anyone the cottage existed, I had already built a legal fence around it. My father, Graham Bennett, taught shop class at the same high school in Wyoming, Michigan, for 31 years. Some children learn to ride a bicycle by being told to keep their balance. I learned after my father made me check the slope of our driveway with an old brass level. He believed you never trusted a surface until you measured it, and that principle followed me into adulthood. I manage contracts for a medical device company in Grand Rapids. I am the person who reads page 41 while everyone else is already reaching for a pen. I find renewal traps, cancellation clauses, hidden fees, and obligations that become expensive only after everyone has forgotten signing them. In my family, that made me useful in the same way a fire extinguisher is useful. When someone needed a lease reviewed, a warranty challenged, or an insurance appeal written late at night, they called me. But when the family made actual decisions, my opinion rarely carried the same weight. My older sister, Lauren, was 3 years ahead of me and had always moved through our family as though the front seat naturally belonged to her. I was the quieter daughter, the one expected to smooth things over because surrendering usually cost less than arguing. I was trusted with paperwork and consulted on almost nothing. Over time, I learned that when I could not win a conversation, I could still build a structure strong enough to survive it. 3 years before the anniversary, my father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He was 65 then, and 68 by the time of the cottage reveal. The disease did not arrive as one dramatic event. It entered our lives gradually, almost politely, and then began rearranging everything. First, his right hand started trembling. He kept it tucked into his pocket at church, at the hardware store, and during my niece's birthday party, as though hiding it could keep everyone else from naming what he already knew. My father had never been a hands-in-his-pockets kind of man, so I noticed immediately. Then the stairs became harder. My parents lived in a 2-story house built in 1989, a house my father had bought while working 2 jobs and could navigate in darkness by memory alone. Suddenly, the building he knew better than anyone became an obstacle course. Laundry was in the basement. The bathtub had a high side. A hallway rug that had been harmless for decades became a fall risk. My mother, Judith, began sleeping lightly, not because he had fallen, but because she was constantly listening for the sound of him falling. She placed a phone in the bathroom, plugged nightlights into every outlet, and covered her fear with the relentless cheerfulness women of her generation often use, instead of admitting they are terrified. My father hated being watched. He was proud, exact, and stubborn in a way that had once looked like competence and now sometimes looked like danger. Rather than take someone's arm, he would grip a doorframe and pretend to inspect the trim. Rather than admit the stairs frightened him, he would pause halfway down and talk about a loose tread. Over many months, watching him negotiate with his own home broke something in me. A home is supposed to support the people living inside it. Theirs had begun working against them. One winter afternoon, I watched him plan a route from the hallway to the kitchen as carefully as though he were crossing a river. That was the moment I stopped thinking only as a daughter and started thinking as a contracts manager. If the house had become the problem, I would replace the house. There had been a faded photograph on my parents' refrigerator for almost 40 years, held in place by a magnet shaped like a slice of pie. It was taken in June of 1986, when they were newlyweds staying at a $9 a night motel near Maple Lake. In the picture, they sat in folding chairs outside their room. My mother was laughing, and my father still had a full head of hair. They spoke about that week the way other people talk about Paris. My father would sometimes say that one day they would have a place on the water, then one day became two daughters. A teacher's salary, braces, college costs, car repairs, and ordinary life. The dream did not disappear. It simply faded into the background with the photograph. In late 2024, I began searching for a cottage. My requirements made several real estate agents look at me as though I had asked for a unicorn with lake access. It had to be on Maple Lake, specifically. It had to be one story, with no interior steps. It needed room for wider doorways, a bathroom that could become fully accessible, and a bedroom large enough for medical equipment someday, without forcing my parents to hear that phrase while they were still healthy enough to enjoy it. It took nearly a year to find the right property. The final cost, including purchase and renovations, was $510,000. I want to be precise about the money, because later my brother-in-law would speak about that cottage as though it had appeared from some vague family reservoir. It had not. I used $210,000 in savings, built over 11 years of maximum retirement contributions, modest living, and vacations I kept postponing. I used $185,000 my grandmother had left me, money I had never touched because spending it felt like opening her hands. I raised the final $115,000 by selling my downtown condominium. I moved into a rented one-bedroom apartment and told everyone I wanted less space to clean. Not $1 came from my parents, my sister, my brother-in-law, or any family account. Every dollar was mine, and every dollar had a documented source. I closed on the cottage in February 2026. The first time I stood alone on the dock as the legal owner, I cried harder than I expected. Then I wiped my face, opened a project folder, and started checking measurements. For the next 4 months, the cottage became a second job. I was not trying to create a luxury lake house. I was trying to build the one opponent my father's disease could not defeat. The shower had zero entry, with no raised lip, a teak bench, and a handheld sprayer. The flooring throughout the cottage was slip-resistant and rated for wet feet. I made the contractor lay out 6 samples and walk across them in socks before I approved one. Every door had a lever handle because turning a knob is a grip strength test, and my father already had enough tests built into his day. Doorways were widened. White oak grab rails were installed where he would need them, but I refused the cold chrome rails that would have made the cottage feel clinical. I wanted the support to look intentional, warm, and permanent, not like medical equipment apologizing for being visible. Behind the cottage, I had a gently sloped path built from the porch to the dock, with a continuous cedar handrail. The goal was simple. My father needed to be able to reach the water on his own schedule without someone hovering beside him. The slope and rail took 3 attempts to get right. I paid for the 3rd attempt without complaint because the entire point was independence, and independence is not an area where close enough means anything. The crew started calling me the level lady because I checked every section with my father's old brass level. I accepted the nickname as a compliment. Because the property was empty during renovations and worth more than $500,000, I installed a doorbell camera at the front entrance. I was cautious, not suspicious. The camera recorded every vehicle, visitor, delivery, and contractor who approached the house. At the time, I believed that meant I had control over who entered. Later, I learned the difference between seeing someone cross a threshold and understanding what they intended to do once they were inside. In March, 1 month after closing, I met with a trusts and estates attorney named Camille Brooks. We transferred the cottage into an irrevocable trust called the Maple 40 Trust. An independent professional trustee, Harborstone Fiduciary, held legal title. My parents were named lifetime beneficiaries with the exclusive right to occupy the property for as long as either of them lived. The occupancy agreement was written in plain language and reviewed repeatedly. The cottage could not be sold, mortgaged, licensed, leased, or used as a short-term rental without the trustee's prior written approval. My parents would have security and full use of the home. while no relative could pressure them into borrowing against it, selling it, or converting it into someone else's business plan. Camille asked the standard questions about taxes, long-term care planning, and Medicaid look-back rules. Then she looked over her glasses and asked whether there was anyone in my family I was specifically worried about. I said no too quickly. After that, I paid her to make the no rental language even tighter. I have thought about that moment many times. I could not bring myself to say my brother-in-law's name in a law office designed for exactly that kind of concern, but I was willing to spend $300 an hour writing around him. That was how I handled conflict then. I did not have confrontations. I had provisions. The deed was recorded in March. The legal fence stood 3 months before anyone tried to climb it. My brother-in-law, Nolan Sawyer, was 41 and described himself as the founder of Sawyer Property Group LLC, though as far as I could tell, he was also its only employee. During the decade I had known him, he had launched a supplement company, a dropshipping store, a real estate mentorship program, and 2 other ventures that ended with attorneys and were never discussed afterward. Nolan believed an idle asset was a dying asset with the intensity other people reserve for religion. He could turn any family dinner into a lecture about leverage, cash flow, or unlocking value. Once, while eating my mother's pot roast, he silently appraised the furniture around the dining room with his eyes. You could almost see him assigning resale prices to each piece. He was charming because charm was part of the machinery. My sister loved him with the fierce defensiveness of someone who had invested not only money, but identity in another person's success. Any criticism of Nolan became, in Lauren's mind, criticism of her judgment and her marriage. 19 days before the anniversary, I realized I could not complete the surprise alone. I needed someone to stock the refrigerator, arrange flowers, make the beds, and help get my parents north without making them suspicious. I sat at Lauren's kitchen table, swore her to secrecy, and told her what I had done. For one warm minute, she was not the sister who competed with me or talked over me. She was 12 again, and I was 9, and we were both daughters who loved the same parents. Her eyes filled with tears. She hugged me and promised she would protect the surprise. I gave her the spare key. The doorbell camera recorded the value of that promise. Lauren's car appeared in the cottage driveway that same weekend, which was expected. Nolan was sitting in the passenger seat, which was not. 19 days later, a family I had never met would open my parents' future home with a code he provided. I managed the surprise through a spreadsheet because that was the only way I knew to keep something so emotional from becoming chaotic. I ordered a lemon cake, made in the same flavor my parents had served at their wedding. I bought champagne. I wrote a toast and revised it 6 times. I had a ceremonial key, made from solid brass, engraved with their initials, G and J, and the words, 40 years. The key sat inside a small velvet box in my briefcase, beside the recorded deed, trust instrument, and occupancy agreement. My plan was to let them celebrate first, then explain the documents gently, without turning the day into a legal seminar. The camera continued sending notifications. Lauren's car appeared on Tuesday, then Saturday. I assumed she was doing exactly what I had asked. Once, an unfamiliar vehicle showed up, and I called her immediately. She laughed and told me it belonged to the florist. "Morgan, breathe," she said. So I did. That detail stayed with me because I had not ignored a warning. I had checked. The problem was that I trusted the answer. A retired Lake Patrol officer named Everett lived nearby. I learned later that he had begun noticing unfamiliar SUVs arriving on weekends. When he asked who they were, they told him they were guests who had booked the cottage online. He had no reason to know the property was supposed to be a secret gift, and I had no reason to ask him what he was seeing. The information remained separated until the morning it was standing in front of me with rolling suitcases. The anniversary plan was exact. Lauren would pick up our parents at 9 in the morning and tell them she was taking them to brunch at a new cafe overlooking Maple Lake. I would leave Grand Rapids at 9:30 with the cake, champagne, and briefcase. At 10:15, I would reach the cottage while Lauren stalled them at a scenic overlook 2 minutes away. Then she would bring them down the road, and I would be waiting at the front door with the engraved key. I had imagined the reveal so many times that it had camera angles in my head. I could see my mother covering her mouth. I could see my father noticing the rail to the dock. I could hear the silence before one of them began to cry. I drove north with the windows down and the cake secured by the passenger seatbelt. The lake looked metallic under the morning light, and I remember thinking that by dinner my parents would be people who lived beside it. Then I turned onto the gravel drive and saw two SUVs parked nose out near the porch. The steel lockbox was attached above the lever handle I had chosen for my father's hands. The wooden sign near the mailbox carried Nolan's surname, as though he had branded the property. For several seconds, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. I checked the cedar rail, leading to the dock, to make sure I had not turned into the wrong driveway. Then I saw my mother. Judith stood in the center of the gravel, wearing the dress she had chosen for her anniversary brunch. Her body was shaking, but she was not crying. That was worse. Crying releases something. Shaking means the body is still under siege. My father stood beside her with his feet planted unusually wide and his back too straight. I recognized the stance. It was how he held himself when the tremor was strong, and he refused to let it become visible in public. He was not looking at the house. He had fixed his eyes on a point across the lake, as though geometry alone could keep him upright. A cheerful family of 5 came through the front door carrying coolers and beach bags. They wore swimsuits and cover-ups and had no idea they were leaving the scene of a family disaster. The father smiled at us and said the place was gorgeous. He gave it 5 stars, he added, and said Nolan had been an extremely responsive host. One of the children ran down the sloped dock path, sandals striking the boards of the route I had rebuilt 3 times for my father. My mother made a small sound in her throat. The guests loaded their vehicles and drove away. Their tires faded down the road, leaving the 4 of us in the driveway with the lockbox, the sign, and a silence none of us understood yet. My mother looked at me. Her voice was so small I almost did not recognize it. "Morgan, there were strangers in the house." She stopped, pressed her lips together, and tried again. "Lauren says." Another pause. Then she asked the question that stripped the entire morning down to its center. "Whose house is this?" Before I could answer, the screen door opened, and Nolan stepped onto the porch with his arms spread wide. He was smiling like a man arriving at the moment he had planned. That was when I understood he did not feel caught. He believed he was hosting. "There they are," Nolan called, as he came down the porch steps. "Graham, Judith, happy anniversary. Come inside." We cleaned up after checkout. Inside the cottage, the home I had built for my parents had been rearranged into a rental listing. Decorative throw pillows I had never bought were lined across the sofa. A laminated guest binder sat on the coffee table. A basket of single-serve coffee pods occupied the counter, where I had imagined my mother placing her teapot. Nolan guided us through the room with the confidence of a realtor conducting an open house. He explained that he had listed the cottage 2.5 weeks earlier and already secured 6 summer bookings. The gross revenue, he said, was $19,400. Peak weeks would be rented, but my parents could use the cottage during most off-season weekdays. Naturally, he assured them, family would receive priority. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and produced a check for $2,100. He presented it to my mother with both hands as though awarding her a diploma. "First payout," he said. "First of many." My mother stared down at the check as though it were something dead. "But whose house is this?" she asked again, and this time her voice cracked. Nolan looked directly into her eyes and answered with the line he had clearly rehearsed. "It belongs to the family now." Lauren stood near the fireplace, smiling with open pride. She looked as though she expected applause. I placed my briefcase on the coffee table, directly over the laminated guest binder. The click of the latches sounded unnaturally loud, but I did not open it yet. In contract negotiations, I had learned never to reveal everything before the other side finished explaining its position. So I asked Nolan a few simple questions in the calm, neutral voice I used at work when a vendor was about to discover that I had read the agreement more carefully than they had. "Who signed the rental agreements with the guests?" He hesitated, then recovered. "I did. Sawyer Property Group manages the property." "And where were the payouts deposited?" "The business account. Then we distribute the proceeds." "Judith is holding the first distribution." He said distribute as though he were feeding a crowd. One more question, I said. Who authorized you to lease this property? His expression shifted into patient condescension. He spoke slowly, as though my failure to understand was the real inconvenience. Morgan, a family asset sitting empty is a family problem. We solved it. You, of all people, should understand efficient use of capital. Lauren stepped forward, with her arms folded. And honestly, you were going to hide an entire house from us. From your own family. We found out, and we handled it like adults instead of turning it into some strange secret. In less than a minute, they had rewritten my role. I was no longer the person who had sacrificed her home and savings to care for our parents. I was selfish for keeping the surprise private. They were not trespassing on a gift. They were rescuing an asset from me. I felt the old family reflex rise inside me. Absorb the insult, lower the temperature, fix everything later without making anyone uncomfortable. Then I looked at my father. He had moved to the hallway and was running his thumb slowly along the white oak rail, back and forth, as though he could read my intention through the grain. He still had not spoken. My mother asked us to sit down and talk like a family, using the bright, fragile hostess voice she always reached for when everything around her was breaking. We sat on furniture staged for strangers, and Nolan continued selling the plan. He talked about occupancy rates, seasonal pricing, cleaning fees, and the advantage of a self-managing asset. My father sat with both hands pressed flat against his thighs to steady them. His silence had weight, and everyone else talked more loudly to avoid feeling it. Then Nolan said something he should not have known. Look, based on a $430,000 purchase price before renovation, the projected gross return is excellent for this lake. $430,000 was the original purchase price. That number existed in one place at the cottage. The closing documents inside a locked file drawer in the office. The key to that drawer had been on the same ring as the spare key I gave Lauren. My parents did not know the figure. Neither did the florist, the contractor, or the neighbors. I looked at my sister. She immediately turned toward the window and became deeply interested in the lake. At that moment, the last part of me still hoping Nolan had acted independently disappeared. Lauren had either opened the drawer and photographed my files, or allowed him to do it. She had not merely betrayed the surprise. She had helped him inventory it. Nolan, I said, keeping my voice level, where did you get 430? The pause before he answered lasted only half a second, but it was long enough. I opened the briefcase. The contents had been arranged for a completely different scene. I had planned to pour champagne, offer a toast, place the velvet box in my mother's hands, and then explain the legal documents in warm, ordinary language. Instead, I laid them across a rental coffee table in the order I would use during a hostile contract meeting. First came the recorded deed. Legal title had been held by the Maple 40 Trust since March. Next came the trust instrument, identifying Harborstone Fiduciary as the independent trustee. Then I placed the occupancy agreement in front of my parents. Their names, Graham and Judith Bennett, were printed in bold beneath the words, exclusive lifetime right of occupancy. Finally, I read the clause I had paid Camille to strengthen. No lease, license, short-term rental, or other commercial occupancy was permitted without the trustee's prior written consent. I opened the velvet box last. Inside lay the brass key, engraved with G and J and 40 years. It caught the lake light through the window, 3 months early and half a day too late. The cottage was never sitting empty, I told Nolan. It was waiting to be given. This is Mom and Dad's home. Legally, it is not mine anymore. It is not yours. And it does not belong to some undefined family pool. Every rental agreement you signed is unauthorized. My mother made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. She covered her mouth with both hands, exactly as I had imagined, in the worst possible version of the moment. My father closed his eyes. Lauren stared at the deed, then at the trustee's name, then at the key. The pride drained from her face. For several seconds, no one spoke. Nolan recovered first. He picked up the deed and read it with his lips moving, like a man checking the numbers on a lottery ticket. Then, Instead of apologizing, he tried to turn the legal barrier into another opportunity. Okay, he said. This is actually fine. Better, even. The trust can approve the rentals. Harborstone signs off. I manage the property professionally, and we split the revenue. Your parents can take 30%. My parents have the right to use the entire house, I said. You are offering them a percentage of income from their own anniversary gift. His voice tightened. I have confirmed bookings. Deposits have been spent. There are cleaning contracts. I have a hot tub installer scheduled for Thursday. If we cancel the summer, there will be penalties and terrible reviews. I could lose my host rating. Everything he had said that morning suddenly had one clear subject: what he would lose. What exactly did you think you were risking? I asked. When you promised strangers they could stay in a house you did not own. Lauren's anger arrived the moment the power shifted away from her husband. You are doing the paperwork thing again, she said. You make everyone feel stupid and small. Nolan put in work. I put in work. You would have known that if you had not hidden everything from us, as though we were thieves. The word thieves settled over the room and began naming objects: the copied documents, the rental income, the lockbox, the branded sign, the strangers who had slept in my parents' future bedroom. My mother whispered Lauren's name, but my sister kept going. Finally, underneath the accusations, she admitted the truth. He needed this one, Morgan. You have no idea what the last few years have been like. I gave him the key the same day you gave it to me. He did not sneak behind my back. I gave it to him. That confession hurt more than anything Nolan had said. He was exactly the man I had always suspected him of being. Lauren was the person I had chosen to trust. My mother took me into the kitchen. It was designed with a continuous countertop from the sink to the stove, so my father could slide a pot rather than carry it with unsteady hands. She gripped both of my wrists and told me she understood. She had seen the deed and heard the clause. She knew what Nolan and Lauren had done was wrong, though she could not bring herself to say a stronger word for it. Then she reminded me that it was her 40th wedding anniversary. Relatives were driving in from Ohio. 40 guests would arrive that evening. She had spent her life taking care of everyone else's milestones and wanted, for one night, to be celebrated without another person's crisis taking over. Please do not make a scene, she said. Settle it after the party. That sentence was not merely a request in my family. It was the operating system. It represented decades of my mother purchasing peace by swallowing discomfort, and decades of me helping her make the payments. She was not wrong to want her party. That was what made the moment so painful. The person I had built the legal fence for was asking me to leave the gate open for one more night. Every habit I had told me to agree. I could keep everyone calm, wait until Monday, and let an attorney handle the conflict. Through the kitchen doorway, I saw my father standing near the hallway rail, his thumb moving along the oak. I kissed my mother's forehead. I promise you will have your party, I said. There will be no scene here. I kept the promise, though not in the way anyone expected. I walked onto the porch alone, past the lockbox, bolted to the door, and made 2 calls in the June sunlight. I summarized the situation in 4 sentences: unauthorized listing, active bookings, collected deposits, and no trustee approval. She became silent only long enough to take notes. Then she told me not to negotiate with Nolan. Because I was no longer the legal owner, this was not a private dispute between siblings. The trustee had an obligation to protect the trust property. Camille contacted Harborstone fiduciary while I remained on the line. The trustee reviewed the deed, the occupancy agreement, and the listing information. That afternoon, Harborstone submitted a formal report to the rental platform as the legal owner of record. The report stated that the listing was unauthorized and that the host had no ownership interest or permission to rent the property. The documents gave the platform something emotions never could: a clear chain of title and an enforceable restriction. The check-in scheduled for 5 o'clock that evening never happened. The platform's trust and safety team removed the listing, canceled all 6 summer reservations, and refunded the guests. The full $19,400 was reversed from Sawyer Property Group's payout account. I later learned that Nolan had already committed much of that money to contractors and purchases. The account could not absorb the reversal. Before leaving for my parents' party, I sat in my car and looked at the lockbox once more. It could remain on the door until the next morning. The important thing was that the legal fence still held, even with someone else's hardware hanging from it. By 4:15 that afternoon, all 5 of us were back at my parents' house in Wyoming, Michigan, moving through the backyard in the strained silence of a family that had agreed to postpone an explosion. Folding tables were covered with cloths. My mother directed the placement of chairs with military focus because logistics were the only part of the day she could still control. Nolan helped hang 40 feet of string lights and even whistled while he worked. His ability to behave as though a disaster were merely an unresolved business conversation would have been impressive if it were not so destructive. Then his phone began vibrating in his pocket. First one notification, then another, then a steady sequence. From across the lawn, I watched him read the notice that the listing had been removed. 6 cancellation emails followed, each confirming a guest refund. The final alert was the payout reversal. $19,400 had been clawed back from the business account. His balance had fallen below zero, and the account was suspended pending review. Nolan gripped a fence post and looked across the yard at me. I was unfolding chairs. I set another one in place. Some people might call what I felt in that moment revenge. It was not. I had not invented a punishment or searched for a way to embarrass him. A contract was enforcing itself against the first person in my life who had assumed my paperwork was decorative. 10 minutes later, Nolan cornered me between the garage and the rose trellis, the place where my family had always held its real conversations away from the table. Up close, the collar of his shirt was damp with sweat, and the polished salesman had vanished. "You have to call the platform," he said. "Tell them it was a family misunderstanding. Say the owner approved it retroactively. Harborstone will listen to you. I am $19,000 negative. I have contracts outstanding. I have a hot tub installer coming Thursday." He stopped and pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. When he spoke again, the performance was gone. "It was supposed to belong to the family. Do you know what it is like to sit at your parents' table for 10 years, as the one whose businesses never worked? Then find out little Morgan quietly has a $500,000 lake house, and never even thought to include me." He cut himself off, but the missing end of the sentence was obvious. His anger was not about my parents. It was about being excluded from an asset he believed could repair his status. Earlier, I had noticed several envelopes spread across the passenger seat of his truck, 2 edged in the red used by collection agencies. I did not mention them. The sight had helped me understand him, but understanding was not the same as excusing him. Nolan was not a criminal mastermind. He was a drowning man who had mistaken my parents' anniversary gift for a shoreline. If I let him keep grabbing it, he would pull them into the water with him. "The trust is not angry with you," I told him. "It is simply not persuadable. You have probably never dealt with anything in this family that could not be pressured, charmed, or exhausted." He stared at me because he knew I was not going to call. Lauren arrived at 6 with a casserole she had agreed to bring before the day collapsed. She set it down hard enough to crack the lid and announced her position within earshot of everyone in the yard. According to her, I was hiding behind documents, humiliating people who actually took action, and turning a family blessing into a courtroom. She said I could not simply be generous. I had to prove I was right. My mother went pale. Lauren threatened to leave rather than watch me play landlord during their anniversary. Then my mother turned to me and asked whether I could soften things for one night. She suggested I tell Nolan we would work something out during the week, even if I did not mean it. Before I could answer, my father spoke from the porch steps. "Judith, leave the girl alone," he said. "She is the only person here who did the math." It was the first thing he had said since the driveway. The sentence cut through the entire yard. He stood using the porch rail, which was the wrong height and one of the features in their old house I had never been able to fix, then went inside. His support should have felt like complete rescue. It did not. Lauren remained, unfolding her chair with the force of a declaration. My mother wiped her eyes and returned to the napkins. I understood that protecting the cottage and preserving the appearance of a united family were no longer compatible goals. No clause in my carefully drafted trust could purchase both. I found my father in the garage before the guests arrived. He sat on his old shop stool at the workbench, tightening the hinge screws on my mother's recipe box because his hands behaved more steadily when they had a specific task. I sat nearby, as I had when I was a child. For a while, neither of us spoke. "You created the trust in March," he said eventually. "Yes." Before Nolan ever touched the place. "Yes." He set down the screwdriver and asked a question that went through every layer of certainty I had built around myself. "Did you build that fence for your mother and me, Morgan? Or did you build it so you would never have to stand in a room and tell your sister no?" Outside, I could hear the caterer arriving and my mother laughing one note too brightly. My father had seen something I had not wanted to examine. Every document in my briefcase was protective and necessary. It was also a way to make an institution deliver the refusal I had never been able to say aloud. Paper had been both armor and a substitute voice. "Both," I admitted. "It can be both." He looked at me with kindness, but did not let me escape the point. "Tonight, it cannot." Then he picked up the recipe box and resumed tightening the hinge. That was the entire sermon. My father had never used 10 words when 4 could carry the weight. The party assembled itself, with the indifferent momentum family events always seem to have. 40 guests arrived. Cousins from Ohio, church friends, neighbors who had watched Lauren and me grow up, and 2 retired shop teachers who had carpooled with my father for years. The string lights came on. The lemon cakes sat at the end of a long table. A slideshow of my parents' marriage played against a sheet stretched along the fence. The motel photograph from 1986 appeared between pictures of newborn babies, bad haircuts, school concerts, minivans, graduations, and all the ordinary years that had carried them to this one. My mother moved through the yard, radiant and exhausted. Whatever else had happened, she was finally being celebrated, and I was grateful for that. Lauren behaved like a gracious co-host, warm to everyone except me. Our family had always been able to conduct a cold war while keeping the buffet line moving. Nolan had showered and changed into a fresh shirt. He laughed at the correct volume, refilled glasses, and shook hands as though the notifications on his phone had never arrived. Something about his energy made me watch him. He was not merely helping, he was preparing. I saw him approach my uncle Daniel, who was acting as master of ceremonies because he owned a wireless speaker. Nolan leaned close, tapped the microphone, and mimed a brief toast. My uncle, a man who had never suspected anyone of strategic intent, gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up. Every contract instinct I had began ringing at once. Nolan had lost the listing, the deposits, and legal access to the cottage. But there was one thing he could still claim if I remained silent: the story of who had given it. After dinner, Uncle Daniel tapped the microphone and produced a burst of feedback. He made a joke about the sound system, then announced that Nolan wanted to say a few words before the cake was cut. My mother reached for her wine. My father became very still. I sat at the far table, with my hands folded, and felt the old family operating system activate inside me. The trust was safe. The platform had closed the listing. No one could take the house. Perhaps Nolan would simply smooth over the morning. Perhaps it would be easier to let him speak and correct any confusion privately later. That argument had controlled me for most of my life. Do not make a scene. Do not embarrass anyone. Do not turn truth into conflict when silence can preserve the evening. Lauren angled her chair toward her husband and wore the same proud smile she had worn beside the cottage fireplace. Nolan stood, buttoned a jacket he had changed into specifically for the moment, and raised his glass. 40 years, he began. His voice was warm and practiced. 40 years of Graham and Judith showing the rest of us what commitment looks like. Tonight, Lauren and I are honored to add something special to that legacy. He paused exactly long enough for the yard to lean toward him. As of this summer, there is a lakeside retreat at Maple Lake for both of you. It was a family project, and a lot of hands went into making it happen. I especially want to recognize my incredible wife, Lauren, who poured herself into getting the house ready. The yard erupted in applause. It was sincere applause from people who had no reason to question him. Someone whistled. My mother began clapping too, though she looked from Nolan to me with confusion behind her smile. The speech was carefully engineered. Almost nothing in it was completely false. There was a cottage. Lauren had carried groceries inside. Many hired workers had contributed. But no one audits the clauses of a toast. By the following morning, 40 households would remember that Nolan and Lauren had given my parents a lake house. My 18 months of searching, the sale of my condominium, the renovations, the trust, the oak rails, and every dollar I had saved would dissolve into a family project. Nolan had lost control of the property, so he was trying to secure authorship. My father was not applauding. He looked directly at me with the same steady attention he used when checking whether a board was level. He did not gesture or rescue me. He simply waited to see what I would do. My glass felt heavy in my hand. The words "do not make a scene" rose inside me again. And for the first time I recognized them not as wisdom but as a command that had kept me voiceless. I thought about the brass level, the locked drawer, my sister looking away from the $430,000 figure, and my father's question in the garage. I stood. My chair scraped against the ground, and 40 faces turned toward me. In the second before I spoke, I saw Nolan clearly. Sweat shone near his temple beneath the string lights. For once, I did not see only the salesman who had stolen access to the cottage. I saw the collection notices on his truck seat and the decade he had spent trying to become the successful son-in-law. I saw a man who had confused providing with possessing and family with a portfolio. I even felt sorry for him. None of that changed what needed to be said. Understanding why someone is drowning does not require handing them your father's home as a flotation device. Uncle Daniel assumed I was the second scheduled speaker and passed me the microphone. "And now the other sister," he said cheerfully. I almost laughed. The other sister had been my role for most of my life. "I want to add something to Nolan's toast," I said. His smile tightened. "He is right that there is a house, and he is right that many hands worked on it. I hired most of them." A few cousins laughed uncertainly. I kept my eyes on my parents. "Mom, Dad, 18 months ago, I started searching for a place on Maple Lake because of the photograph that has been on your refrigerator since 1986. I found the cottage in February. I used everything I had saved, the inheritance from Grandma, and the money from selling my condominium. Then I spent 4 months rebuilding it for both of you." My mother's hand rose to her mouth. "The shower has no step, Dad. The floors are slip-resistant. Every door has a lever handle. There is an oak rail inside, and a cedar rail from the porch all the way to the dock. I checked every section with your level." Someone behind me whispered, "Oh my God," with the quiet reverence of a person speaking in church. It was supposed to be revealed this morning with champagne and the key. Instead, Mom and Dad arrived to find strangers leaving the house because, for the previous 2.5 weeks, it had been rented without my permission or the trustees' approval. 6 bookings produced $19,400 in revenue for a business that had no legal right to list the property. The applause had vanished. Even the insects seemed loud in the silence. So let me finish the toast accurately. The cottage is yours, Mom and Dad. It is protected in an irrevocable trust. No one can rent it, mortgage it, borrow against it, sell it, or manage it on your behalf without the independent trustees' approval. It is not a family business. It is not an income stream. It is not available. I raised my glass slightly. Happy 40th anniversary. The key is real this time. Nolan could have sat down and allowed the truth to settle. Instead, he stepped into the aisle between the tables and began speaking loudly without waiting for the microphone. "This is exactly what I mean," he said. "This is the paperwork performance she always does. We had a functioning arrangement that benefited everyone. The house would pay for itself. Graham and Judith would earn money, and Morgan destroyed the entire plan out of spite this afternoon. Ask her what she did to my business." His voice rose with each sentence. The more he tried to sound powerful, the more clearly everyone heard the arithmetic. My savings, my deed, his listing. I brought the microphone closer. I reported an unauthorized rental to the platform. The legal owner submitted the deed and trust documents. The platform removed the listing. That is the entire story. Lauren stood so quickly her chair shifted backward. 2 red patches appeared high on her cheeks. "Do not make a scene, Morgan," she hissed. The oldest rule in our family had been deployed against me in front of the same relatives who had unknowingly applauded a lie. I felt the sentence land, and then, for the first time, felt it fail. "This is not a scene," I told her. "It is a boundary. You have simply never seen one at this table before." Nolan slammed his wine glass onto the nearest table. Wine jumped over the rim, and one of my aunts pulled her purse out of the way. He played the last card he had left. "That cottage belongs to the family. It belongs to Mom and Dad," I replied. That was always the point. The silence that followed was longer than any argument. Lauren picked up her bag, took Nolan by the arm, and announced that they would not stay to be humiliated. Then my sister and her husband walked out through the side gate while 40 guests watched. At that exact moment, the slideshow displayed a photograph of Lauren and me at 7 and 10 years old, wearing matching windbreakers and holding hands on a dock. The gate struck the post behind them with a flat wooden sound. My mother stood halfway out of her chair, torn between the daughter leaving and the daughter holding the microphone. Her celebration had become exactly what she had begged us to avoid. For several seconds, no one moved. Then my father rose. He did it slowly, planting his cane and refusing every offered arm. He crossed the yard toward me and held out his hand for the microphone. His hand was trembling. He did not hide it in his pocket. He allowed everyone to see the movement as he wrapped his fingers around the microphone. 40 years ago, he said, I promised Judith we would have a place on the water someday. On a teacher's salary with 2 daughters, someday kept moving. He looked at my mother, not at the guests. My youngest kept the promise for me. She built the place so I can walk to the dock on my own. She checked it with my level, I am told. His breath caught, and he paused until he could continue. I do not have a speech. Judith, the water is ours. Raise your glasses. My mother laughed and sobbed at the same time, and I knew I would remember that sound for the rest of my life. My father's hand kept trembling around the microphone, but he did not hide it or apologize for it. He let everyone see the tremor while he finished the toast. That was his answer to the question he had asked me in the garage. A document could protect the cottage, but it could not stand in that yard and speak the truth for me. I had to do that myself. My parents moved into the cottage during the second week of September, when the maples along the shore turned the color of struck matches. The lockbox came off the front door in about 90 seconds. My father insisted on removing it himself, seated in a lawn chair with his cordless drill and working at his own pace. The Sawyer Lake House retreat sign became kindling in October. My mother called that wasteful, and then watched it burn with unmistakable satisfaction. We repeated the key ceremony properly with champagne, lemon cake, the velvet box, and the brass key engraved with G and J and 40 years. It happened 3 months late, and exactly right. 4 chairs had been set, but only 3 were occupied. Lauren did not come. She still has not come. She sends the children's school pictures to my mother and speaks to me in the polished, distant language of a holiday card. For a while, I waited for the relationship to thaw. Eventually, I stopped waiting. Some doors can remain unlocked without requiring you to stand in them. Nolan reached a repayment arrangement with the rental platform and sold his newer truck. By the following spring, he had rebranded himself online as a family wealth mindset coach. I have chosen to find that funny because the alternative would be giving his lack of self-awareness more room in my life. No one sued anyone. The trust did not need revenge, a public spectacle, or a courtroom battle. It simply refused to authorize what he had done and never changed its position. Trusts do not become tired, guilty, or sentimental. They follow the document. The most unexpected outcome involved my parents' old 2-story house. It did not sell. On Camille's advice, the property was transferred into the trust, and Harborstone arranged a conventional long-term lease with vetted tenants at market rate. Every dollar of rent now goes into a fund for my parents' care, and every signature passes through the trustee. It is a rental conducted openly, lawfully, and with consent. My mother says Nolan would appreciate the irony. I do not think he would. People like Nolan rarely appreciate irony when it prevents them from controlling the asset. The following November, I stood at the cottage kitchen window and watched my father walk the entire path to the dock alone. He held his cane in one hand and kept the other on the rail I had checked with his brass level. My instinct was to go outside and help him, but I stayed where I was. He moved slowly and stopped when he needed to, yet he completed the distance on his own. At the end of the path, he stood facing the water that had waited 40 years for him. That image is what remained after the lockbox, the reversed payout, the ruined toast, and the side gate closing behind my sister. The cottage had never been only a piece of property. It returned choice to two people who had been losing it in small increments. The rails protected my father from a house that demanded more balance and grip than he could reliably give. The trust protected my parents from anyone who viewed their security as unused capital. Speaking at the party protected the truth from a family habit that had confused silence with kindness. For most of my life, I believed a boundary was something written into a clause, locked inside a drawer, or enforced by an institution strong enough to say no for me. Those protections mattered. Without them, Nolan could have continued renting the cottage, attempted to borrow against it, or pressured my parents to accept an arrangement designed around his debts. The legal fence was necessary, but my father was right about the other half. I had also used paperwork to avoid standing in front of my sister and saying a sentence she might hate. Protection is incomplete when it exists only inside a file. At some point, the boundary has to become a voice. A gray lockbox once hung from the door I had paid for. A brass key, engraved with 40 years, waited inside my briefcase. Months later, my father walked toward the lake with one hand on his cane and the other following the rail I had measured for him. I did not rush outside to steady him. I trusted the structure we had built and let him use it. A fence around the people you love is not a lack of love. Sometimes it is the final shape love takes when someone begins measuring your family only by what it can earn.